If you want to look at the biggest predictor of whether or not you're engaged at work, and this is true for every industry and every company, if you happen to be in close proximity to a real leader, someone that cares about you, that gives you good feedback, that helps you along the way, your chances of being engaged increases exponentially. But if you don't have that, you're potentially in trouble. So we say the antidote is heal, help engage authentic leadership, because that makes apparently a pretty big difference. I think there are generations of workers now that are lost. They're struggling to find a sense of identity, a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, and I think we can help.
In Search of a Leader is a podcast for those seeking more, a life of purpose, a career that truly matters, and leadership that inspires lasting change.
We have an epidemic that's raging across the country, across the world, and it's called employee disengagement. And unless we begin to talk about this, it's not going to get any better.
Together, we go in search of a leader.
Why don't we start off by just maybe speaking a little bit to the why of this particular conversation. I'm going to tell you a story. This is the story of a guy named Patrick Sherrill. He's 44 years old, decorated ex-Marine, lives in a little town of Edmond, Oklahoma. He is a relief carrier for the post office. Most of his friends say, Patrick's a nice enough guy, pretty competent at what he does. He doesn't particularly like his job, but he's an okay guy. But on the afternoon of August 19th, Patrick gets pulled into his supervisor's office, and he's given basically a verbal reprimand. Now, we'll probably never know exactly what that was, but it's pretty clear that Patrick went home that day even angrier than normal. The next day, Patrick shows up on time at work, 6:45 a.m., carrying the same mail bag that he always carried. But on this particular day, he's not carrying a change of clothes, and he's not carrying his lunch in that mail bag. He's carrying 3 semi-automatic weapons. He locks the door behind him, and then he turns around and he slaughters 20 of his coworkers, kills 14, wounds 6, and then he turns the gun on himself. It was an atrocity that at the time, most of America had never heard of before. It was a workplace shooting, one of the very first. It introduced to our lexicon something we'd never heard before, going postal, which means the employee that basically has gotten to the point where they can't take it anymore and they've had it and they just react. I think the tragedy of that has multiple dimensions, but this is the thing that I think about. When we think about why Patrick got to where he was, it's easy to go to mental health, and certainly mental health is a big problem. It's easy to default to gun control and greater police enforcement, but at the core, one of the things that maybe we should have more of a conversation around is, if people are not happy at work, why aren't they happy? And I would tell you that the dark cloud that caused that terrible event has grown darker. And that doesn't mean everybody walks into their place of employment and shoots others, but we have an epidemic that's raging across the country, across the world, and it's called employee disengagement. Now, employee disengagement is one of those $100 consultant terms for, hey, I'm mad as hell, I don't want to be here anymore, and I've lost purpose in my career. So I think one of the things that we want to try to say to people in this podcast and others is that we have something that we need to have a conversation around. People that go to work that have no sense of purpose, in many cases no sense of hope, and they don't want to be there anymore.
Yeah.
And the problem is getting worse, it's not getting better. So I'll give you a couple facts and figures, and then let's talk about this. Employee disengagement, again, the $100 consultant term, is costing the world around $8.8 trillion a year. $8.8 trillion. That's 9% of the global gross domestic product. It's costing this country $500 billion a year. It's bigger than the combined GDP of UK, France, and Russia combined. It's monstrous. But most people have never heard of it before. Here's the real tragedy. The real tragedy is we have skyrocketing levels of mental illness, of depression, of drug addiction. We have families that are broken, spirits that are broken. And unless we begin to talk about this, it's not going to get any better.
I hear the word burnout used a lot today, especially in healthcare circles, but really across all industries. What you're talking about is a step beyond burnout. And when I hear people that are highly disengaged, there's a word that comes to mind. It's despair. It's when you're going through the motions, you feel like your work no longer matters. In many cases, it's not being acknowledged, and you feel like it's never actually going to get better. I heard something recently that's stuck with me. It says, today we show love through undivided attention. In other words, engagement. And I think most people live lives of quiet desperation because they don't have engagement in their lives. We are dealing with a silent epidemic. And like any other epidemic, we need to know the symptoms and we need to know how to stop it. How do we do that?
Well, that's a good point. I look at it like this. About a third of the workers, 162 million workers in this country, a third of them are highly engaged. Everybody else is something less. That's pretty scary.
Right.
But here's what's really scary. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of all those workers are exactly what you just described, actively disengaged. Whether you call it burnout or despair or I've lost the will to live, whatever it might be, that's sapping us of something that's far more important than productivity and profitability. It's the human spirit.
Yeah.
So you ask yourself, how do we address it? I think what we would say for people that are listening, if working for a living is making living a lot of work for you, maybe we can offer you some solutions. So let me give you an acronym that I use when I work with companies around employee disengagement. Here's the acronym. It's POISON, but it's odorless and it's tasteless, and unfortunately a lot of people don't know until they've already been poisoned. But POISON stands for P, it's always personal. It's always personal. O, it's overwhelming. I, it's isolating. You feel like you're the only person in the world that's experiencing this. But the S is the one I think is the one we got to get our heads around. S stands for septic. And by that I mean it's contagion. It's infectious. Not only does it sweep across you, but every time you reach across and touch someone, literally or figuratively, you run a strong risk of infecting them too, which is the tragedy of all this thing. O, it obscures, and N, to your point, it's never ending. I'm never going to get out of this. How did I ever get to this point? And what am I going to do about it? And so what we generally say is, if you want to look at the biggest predictor of whether or not you're engaged at work, and this is true for every industry and every company, if you happen to be in close proximity to a real leader, someone that cares about you, that gives you good feedback, that helps you along the way, your chances of being engaged increases exponentially. But if you don't have that, you're potentially in trouble. So we say the antidote is heal. Help engage authentic leadership. Help engage authentic leadership, because that makes apparently a pretty big difference.
So for this epidemic, we know what the symptoms are. It's poison. I love that acronym. That's easy to follow. We know the incidence rate. We know the prevalence rate. We know the mechanism of transfer. And if the treatment plan is help engage authentic leadership, how do we do that when some individuals have already asked for help? Others have reached levels of disengagement where they're not even in a position to ask anymore. How do we bring authentic leadership back into people's lives?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think you have to speak truth to power, and this is, as a consultant and as an executive coach, I sometimes have to do this. Here's one. If 1/3 of your people are highly engaged, and that means 2/3 aren't, here's a hard truth for a lot of companies. That means that you probably have 2/3 of your leadership team that aren't very good at what they do. And sometimes that hits people between the eyes, but it's true. There's a wide gulf between leaders and managers. I've always said those who cannot lead at best hope to manage, and those who cannot manage at best hope to control, and those who cannot control at best hope to coerce. We got a lot of controllers and coercive agents out there that believe they're leading. They're not leading anything other than people into oblivion. So when I work with companies and offer consultation, I always say, look, managers at the very root of the word means to handle things. Managers handle things. Peter Drucker, 1950, said management's controlling, planning, staffing, directing, organizing. That's basic stuff. That's stability. Leaders, on the other hand, if you look at the root of the word, means to evoke action. Action's something totally different. Leaders move people forward. The best definition, I think at least the best definition I've ever heard of leadership is if your actions inspire others to dream more or to learn more or to do more or be more, then you're a leader. Our challenge is we don't have a lot of leaders and a lot of companies, and unfortunately, we operate under the assumption that they're there. But if you don't have inspired followers, I got news for you. You don't have leaders.
So the idea of this heal, authentic leadership, ultimately drives authentic engagement. From my personal experience, I've found when organizations chase productivity and profitability
Yeah.
over people, my engagement plummets. And I can tell you I'm not the only one that feels that way. How do we navigate these dynamics and ensure that we're actually improving and getting better? How do we navigate that when so many people feel that same way that I do?
Question for you. Why do you think people feel that way when they experience that? Why do you think they feel that?
I think they feel like a cog in the wheel.
Yeah.
I think their value has become tied to their performance. In my case, I was no longer an individual that was part of a company. I was just my numbers. And that was it's a hard thing to kind of to process. Your self-worth isn't what you do, but when organizations start to identify you based off of your productivity and your performance and not necessarily who you are, your engagement's going to drop when that happens.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you another story, and you've heard this before, but when I stumbled into industry a gazillion years ago, I didn't have the pedigree, David, that you had. I didn't have the strong business background. I didn't have an appreciation for what business was. I went to work for a little pharmaceutical company for 3 reasons. I wanted a company car, I wanted benefits, and I wanted a strong salary.
Yeah.
I didn't get any of the 3, but I wanted them. I was proud when I got my starting salary, and I won't even tell you what it was because it's so embarrassing, but it was really low. And they put me in a sales role, and they said, hey, go forth and do sales things. I was destined probably to fail because I didn't have an aptitude for sales. I don't think I even had, at that point in my life, an interest in it. And I probably would have failed had I not experienced early in my career, I think, a very unique experience. I met a real leader. I mean, in retrospect, a real leader, an authentic leader. And when I looked at it later, I realized that was an inflection point, because I could look at the sea of imposters and the commanders and the controllers and the autocrats and all those others that had impressive titles, but I saw one that I looked at differently, and I kind of suspected other people did too. And so I said, well, I'm gonna study this person. They're gonna become my compass, my Polaris, my North Star, and if I want to be a leader someday, I'll just copy what they do. And so I focused on that North Star. And I always ask myself this question: what is it that this person does that makes me think so differently about them? Fast forward a couple of years, and I'd had a couple of different jobs by then, and I'd had some degree of success, but I never forgot that individual. Crowded auditorium at our home offices, actually it was at a hotel, probably 1,000 people. And if you've been here before, where you in one of these big meetings, and you hear the hum of the audience. You know what I'm talking about, the hum?
Of course, absolutely.
And you know what that is. It's the side conversations.
Yeah.
You know, we're watching the 4th PowerPoint presentation, and now you're slowly losing the will to live, because it's like, how much more can I endure? Highly impressive people in terms of titles. And back then, this is pre-cell phone. So we didn't have the obstructions that you have now, the things that could take. So people would bring newspapers, and they would do this. People would bring paperback books.
Yeah.
And they would read the paperback books. And more often than not, it's just side conversations. So you get all these people coming up, and on the second or third day, 1:30, 2 o'clock, worst time for a speaker to come up, the guy comes up, the leader that I always was so impressed by. Funny thing happened. Newspapers went to the floor, books closed, side conversations ended. And I'm looking around going, what's happening here? I mean, the mood changed.
Yeah.
I thought, what is going on? Now, I knew this person had gravitas. I knew they had content. I knew they had a lot of things. And I thought, maybe it's their presentation skills. And as I watched them, I found myself more and more, instead of watching that person, looking right and left and going, something's going on here. And I learned something. I learned 2 things that day. One, I learned it's not what great leaders do that make us think so differently about them. It's what they do that make us think so differently about ourselves.
That's good.
And that was powerful. But here's the big thing I learned. You want to understand what leadership is? Spend a lot more time studying the followers rather than the leaders.
How do you interpret that? If you're watching the followers, that just means they're creating a willing followership. What does that mean? I don't even know how to interpret that.
Well, I can tell you how I began to interpret
Yeah.
it. Instead of asking, what is it that the great leader does that makes me think so differently about myself,
Yeah.
I started looking at the followers and asking, what is it that they're asking for? And eventually, and this took years because I was never the brightest, I finally began to realize there are universal questions that we all ask when someone walks in front of us in the room and says, hey, follow me,
Yeah.
because we're not inclined to follow.
Yeah.
I mean, most of us are independent, and even when you want to follow, there's a resistance there. I began to realize that we all have questions of a leader, and those questions seem to be fairly universal. Here's the questions that I eventually came up with, and I call them the 5 follower ask, and I've used some version of this for 25 years.
Okay.
I think when someone walks in front of us and says, follow me, the first question, the first human question we ask is this person credible? Because if they're not credible, why are you going to spend time and attention listening to them? And that means some combination of competency and authenticity, integrity, whatever it might be. We all first want to know, is this person credible?
Mhm.
Makes sense. And then the second one, I think, is really human. We ask, can you make me better? Because if you can't make me better, why am I going to give you a share of mine? Certainly not a share of heart. So those were pretty easy. But when I looked at this leader, and then occasionally as I encountered other what I considered elite leaders, I came up with 3 other questions, and I think they're difference makers. Third question was, do you have a dream I can believe in?
Mm-hmm.
Because when I understand your purpose and it aligns with mine, it gives me hope. And hope is an incredibly powerful emotion. Then the 4th and 5th question, do you care about me and can I trust you? And every great leader I encountered over my 38-year career in traditional industry,
Yeah.
and there were very few, always answered those 5 questions, but there was a caveat. Words won't give you the answer. Only actions will give you the answer.
What are those actions?
That was something I struggled with. I'll tell you, though, when the 5 follower ask became real, even more real for me, 2008, Gallup Group publishes a study that was actually several years in the making, 10,000 followers, multiple industries, multiple companies. They came back and said, hey, you know what? There are 4 universal needs that we all have. And this includes everything from military to sports to business to teaching, any industry. The 4 universal needs, we have a need for stability, we have a need for hope, we have a need for compassion, we have a need for trust. I said, hey, that's great. I mean, that's kind of what I've been talking about for a long time. But I would also tell you, and this is I think a concession to your age group, I think there's a 5th need that the Gallup Group didn't have when the study was completed in 2008. Here's the 5th need. I think particularly for millennials and Gen Z, there is an incredible need for affirmation, for an understanding that you're acknowledged, appreciated, that your work has a sense of purpose. Now, you may disagree with that, but I think millennials and Gen Z, as opposed to my baby boomer generation, really do have a strong need for affirmation. Agree or disagree?
I would agree. I don't know if it's in the sense of they're more sensitive. I think it's more of a reinforcement that companies that give affirmation are honest about what they actually want.
Right.
And if you can reinforce those things that you're talking about, stability, hope, compassion, trust, I think it helps drive individuals that they're with the right company, because there are so many people that feel that they are only as good as their performance.
Right.
So I think that affirmation is basically just a sign of building trust and transparency in what the organization actually stands for. So I would actually agree with that.
Yeah, well, you just said something's pretty powerful. You think any relationship you've ever been in your life, how important was trust? Pretty high.
It's huge.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty high. So when I took my 5 follower ask and lined them up with what I thought were 5 universal needs, I felt like we had something that, from a standpoint of training and development, would make sense. Are you credible? If the answer is yes, well, that's stability. Can you make me better? That's affirmation. Do you have a dream I can believe in? That's hope. Do you care about me? That's compassion. Can I trust you? Well, that's trust. Seems to be pretty logical. Then every leader in every position should be able to engender inspired followers, but it doesn't happen.
Why? Why are we not seeing leaders engaging with something that sounds simple but difficult to actually do? Why aren't we there yet?
Yeah, well, I'll give you 2 reasons that fly off the page. One, we select the wrong people to be leaders.
Okay.
You can take the greatest individual contributor in the world, and that doesn't mean they're a great leader. In fact, in many cases, they're the worst person to select as a leader.
Great.
That's the first thing. The second thing is we don't develop them. And you gave me something that I call it the leader's compass, because after starting work back in the 80s on this, I finally realized after I lined up the ask with the universal needs, and I looked at companies that had elite leaders, I had an epiphany one day. Because when I identified in every organization the very few, and I mean very few, elite leaders, I realized there's really, for most companies, two levels of followership. There are compliant followers and there are committed followers. Compliant followers and committed. But for some elite leaders, there's a third level, and that's loyalty. And I was perplexed. So why doesn't it happen all the time? And you actually hit on something that I think is powerful. Let me tell you what the leader's compass is. And it was ridiculously simple. And I'm almost ashamed it took me 3 or 4 decades to finally put all these pieces together. But at the top of a page, we write out 5 universal needs. The 5 universal needs are stability, affirmation, hope, compassion, and trust. At the bottom of the page, we have 3 levels of followers: compliant, committed, and way over here on the far right, very small group of loyal.
Yeah.
If a compass is a device to provide direction, let me give you 4 compass points, but it's from the follower standpoint, not the leadership standpoint.
Okay.
4 circles, diagonal. The lower left hand is what? We label it what? David, Tim, Joe, Mary, Linda, we go to work for a company and we're assigned to what? This is what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
You came from a world where if you don't hit your sales result, we're going to miss you,
Yeah.
right? I went to work where if I didn't hit a market share, we'll see you next time because we've got 3 other people lined up behind you that can do your job.
Yeah.
Whether it's the number of widgets you have to produce or the production that you have to yield or whatever it might be, there's always a what. The what is the reason you're hired.
Yeah.
And more often than not, people, when they go to work, have an idea of what the what is. So what's leaders' role in that? Well, unfortunately, for a lot of companies, here it is. Nothing. Nothing. You deliver the what. That's all we want.
Yep.
Deliver the what. What does your manager, your coach, your supervisor do? Well, let's see. Classic example, I was working as a consultant with a medical sales group, and they said, we want to take a look at what our line leaders are doing. So I asked the medical rep, you have I think theirs was a district manager. He or she comes to work with you. What do they do when they work with you? Well, they tell me whether or not I'm hitting my goal. Did you not know that before they came? Yeah, I knew it. So what are they doing to help you? Well, they don't do really anything. They just tell me if I'm 75% or 85% or 90%. So what's their contribution? Well, they occupy space in the front of the car. How committed are you to this company? Not very. I wonder why. If you have leaders, supervisors, managers, CEOs, vice presidents whose total focus is just the what, at best you'll have compliant followers. But there's a higher level of leadership. There are some managers, supervisors, VPs that actually say, in addition to that first circle, what, second circle is how. So when I work with you, let's talk about how we can achieve our goals. Let's talk about what the goals are, whatever they might be. Let's share feedback. Let me give you some opinion. Let me help you realize your goal. So coming from the industry that you come from, if you have a manager that helps with the how and not just focused on the what, does that make a difference?
Oh, I would run through walls. I would work for free for them. Yeah, I really would, because that to me, especially in the healthcare world, if you're committed, we're aligned. We have shared purpose, and together we can accomplish a lot. You could find that from people outside of your managers. You could find it from colleagues. You can even find it from customers. Some of the closest customers I ever had helped me get there. So yeah, that meant everything to me. It was hard to find though.
Yeah. Well, you just said a couple things that are powerful. A lot of people assume that leadership is a title. It has to have a title fixed to it. It's anything but.
Yeah.
Leadership is influence.
Agreed.
You can be a senior sales representative in company A and you're helping people around you. I got news for you. Even if the manager is not worth anything, if you've got someone with seniority that will help you, that's the leader.
Yeah.
That's what you want. So when we talk about those first 2 circles, what and how, leaders, whether they have title or not, that influence the how, in many cases are people pushing people from compliance to commitment, and that's great. But I mentioned I studied elite leaders. What is it that they do? This is third circle stuff. Third circle stuff is not just what and how, but why.
Yeah.
And that's a difference maker. If we were to draw a line down the center of this chart, the line would be from top to bottom. It would distinguish between the how and the why, because to the left, that's the domain of managers. They're efficient.
Yeah.
They handle things, controlling, planning, staffing, directing, organizing. But now when you go over to the why, you've entered a whole new realm. Now you're in the realm of leadership. And great leaders can convey the why in such a way that you realize, I'm realizing my purpose, the company can realize their purpose, and together we both achieve more. When I went to work for that little company all those years ago, there came a leader who at one point said to me, Tim, I realize you have three passions. You love the study of leadership. You seem to be very interested in this notion of communication, and you're a compulsive learner. The learning piece probably because I was so far behind, but he said, if you stay here, as this company grows, you're going to realize all those things. That why is going to grow and grow and grow. And then I still remember when I was a couple years with the organization on some kind of a launch team working dawn to dusk on the road all the time, on a Saturday morning, I get a phone call from our founder. He's a billionaire. He calls me and says, hey, I just want you to know what you're doing is making such a difference.
Yeah.
I want you to know I personally appreciate it. I'm going to remember what you're doing, and together we're gonna do something amazing. David, if I could have, I would have jumped out of bed in my underwear and worked the rest of the weekend to drive demand for that guy.
Yeah.
Now, he probably called 20 people that morning. Didn't make any difference.
Yeah.
My why was aligned with his. It's like John Kennedy after he did the famous, we're going to land a man on the moon and return him safely.
Yeah.
The next year, 1962, he's at NASA, and he sees an old man pushing a mop, and he walks away from the crowd and he says, excuse me, sir, I'm John Kennedy. What do you do here? And the old man said, well, Mr. President, I'm helping put a man on the moon.
I love that.
I did too.
I love that.
That's a classic example.
Yeah.
So I figured, all right, I got it now. Great leaders advance from the what to the how to the why. But then there's another ingredient. These higher emotions of compassion and trust, the only time you ever see an elite leader, he or she has not just done the what and the how and the why, they've advanced to the who. They've let you know who they are, and in turn, they know who you are. They've been vulnerable enough to say, I care about you, I understand you, I know what's important, and it's important to me, and there's an alignment. Those higher needs of compassion and trust, you can't give those to a company. Those are distinctively human emotions.
Yeah.
That's the power of the who. And that's where you finally get, in some cases, that's where you finally get loyalty.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, in my opinion, less than 5% of leaders ever get there. They never get there. I tell the story when I was in a senior leadership role, and I was one of 4 or 5 that had divided the country, and I was working with a brilliant leader, but sterile. And in the course of the conversation, I bring up a name because the other 3 or 4 were good friends and the leader was not. And I bring up a name. The name is Brandon. It's a name that you know. He's your older brother. And the person I was reporting to said, who is that? And I'd been working with him for over a year. I said, well, that's my oldest son. He said, oh, you have kids? I said, yeah, I have 2. And I remember exchanging glances with the other people. When that person left, one of my colleagues said, that was the smartest person I ever worked for and the worst leader.
Wow.
So for me, when I think about what leadership can be, and you hit it dead on, leadership is not title. We can all be leaders.
Yeah.
The challenge is whether or not we're really willing to, in this era of talking about artificial intelligence, which I'm all about. I love it. I think from a decision-making, from a data standpoint, from all the things it will do to make us more successful, the thing I keep asking myself, I wonder in the midst of everything that's going on, if we should also devote equal attention to authentic humanity.
You just took the words out of my mouth, humanity. It's amazing how we look at leadership in terms of title. You had mentioned that specifically, and you hear about the chain of authority, the chain of command. I actually think we need to move towards the chain of authenticity. And as you're talking, this is how I interpreted everything that you were just saying. Authentic humanity, and you just used that, leads to authentic leadership, which leads to authentic purpose, which leads to authentic engagement. And it's interesting how so many organizations made engagement the goal when it really should be purpose, aligning purpose and mission. That's only possible with authentic leadership. And what I'm most excited about in hearing this is leadership is not title, it's not experience, it's influence. And together with engagement, you can literally change the world, but more importantly, the people that are a part of it.
That's beautifully said. You know, here's something that we might want to close with for people that are listening to this and going, okay, yeah, but what can I do? I'm a first 6-month employee. We always talk about extending the hand of leadership.
Yeah.
Here are 5 things that everybody can do beginning today. Number 1, you can show up and do your best. Whatever that job is, do your best. Number 2, help somebody.
Yeah.
What a radical thought. Reach out and say, how can I help you? Number 3, look for the good. Optimism is just as contagious as disengagement. Number 4, do what's right. And number 5, treat other people the way that they deserve to be treated. If we can do those things, maybe we can begin to embrace this new term, this term called authentic humanity.
I love it. Thank you guys for listening to In Search of a Leader. Be on the lookout for more episodes to come. Make sure to follow us on social.
For more information, go to insearchofaleader.com.